The moment the emergency klaxon swallowed the hush of the reading vault, Mara Holt's first thought was annoyingly practical. Of course it would happen on a Tuesday. Then, just as quickly, another thought crowded in, a tiny, reckless smile she didn't bother to hide. What if the thing everyone's been terrified of for 1,000 years is actually just a misunderstanding? That smile vanished when the doors ahead of her hissed open and a warm smell like old paper and ozone rolled out, along with a figure she did not expect to see, an Ombra sentinel, all shadowed plates and soft low voice, standing at attention with antennae angled toward the ceiling. "Mara Holt," it said, which was a sentence she'd heard hundreds of times in the gentle formalities of interlibrary transfer requests. This time its translation overlay thinned into static. "You are a human. You are not authorized for containment breach operations." Mara blinked. She'd been cataloging impossible books for 15 years, manuscripts that rewrote themselves, atlases that bled constellations from the margins, treatises on mathematics that insisted they were actually lullabies. Yet her chest did that oddly proud, foolish thing it did when she remembered the coffee mug from a long-ago road trip she insisted on keeping in the staff locker because it reminded her of being stubborn and alive. "That always depends on your definition of authorized," she said. "Also, who authorized the breach? Because I feel like that's a very important bureaucratic point." The sentinel transformed itself into something like amusement, a micro-facet of shadow reshaping around its mandibles. "You have a reputation," it admitted. "You also have a species-level tolerance for improvisation." Mara took the chance of that tolerance like a hand offered in deep water. She'd kept her job all these years because the library's problems were usually the kind you could solve with patience, footnotes, and the occasional ethically questionable use of glue. The archive they called the Codex Confluence, however, had problems that seemed to prefer tragedies, folds of space where whole shelves winked in and out of reality, a sect of books that argued philosophy back at the reader, and, as of 3 minutes ago, a door that had opened on a room none of the Guardians had indexed. "Show me," she said. They walked. The corridor was an old one, lined with spines faded to the color of dusk and labels in languages that jutted and hummed when you passed by. At the end, behind a lattice of runes, sat a portal, humming at the pitch of a throat clearing centuries of secrets. The ward stones around it had been carved in a pattern no living artist practiced anymore, a tight weave meant to hold the kind of thinking that chewed through reality and spat out new geometries. The sentinel touched the ward with a fingertip and recoiled. The ward shouted in a language like wet stone. It was the first sign, Mara thought, that whatever lay behind the door preferred to talk in a metaphysics she didn't entirely trust. "We called for the senior misconception," the sentinel said. "We called for the keeper. The keeper is comfortable with long, unpleasant conversations." The keeper was a position in the library no one really wanted. It involved an entire portfolio of apologies, indemnities, and a significant pension if you survived the first 3 terms. Mara had applied once and been rejected on the grounds that she smiled too often. She accepted that. Smiles were deceptive. She preferred being useful. "Then let's make the keeper unnecessary today, or at least late." They opened the door. They found what seemed both simpler and stranger than anyone's worst theory. The room beyond the ward was not empty. It contained what looked like, from the human angle, a small study. A desk, a chair, a single lamp still burning, though nothing else in the library used fuel like that anymore. On the desk was a book, closed, bound in a skin that remembered 100 languages. Around the book the air shimmered with footprints of impossible creatures that had passed there some time and left nothing but crumbs of probability behind. A small, honest book. A title in charcoal that read in careful handwriting, "The Compendium of Misplaced Things and How to Lie to Them." Mara laughed, and the sound cracked through the silence like porcelain. "Well," she said, "that's embarrassing." It wasn't just the title. The book smelled of home, of rain on warm pavement, and of a kitchen where someone had once burned toast and then laughed about the scorch marks for years after. It was a smell. It was a memory. It was an anchor to a world the Sentinels had not expected to find in a place as cosmically woolly as the Codex Confluence. The Sentinel's antennae twitched. This compendium is not in the registry. No author, no seal. Containment protocols dictate. Mara knelt and touched the book's cover. It accepted her fingers like a lock accepting a key. The lamp on the desk flared as if in approval. The words on the title rearranged themselves into an epigraph. If you find this book, it is because you needed it. If it resists you, it is because you do not yet know the right lie to tell it. Cute, Mara said. Very bureaucratic, like a sign on a door that says, employees only. She opened the book. Words spidered across the page. They were not static, they were behaviors. Each sentence unfolded like a small insect, offering itself to be watched. The first paragraph read like a recipe, and, because the Codex Confluence had no shame in being literal, began insisting on ingredient lists that included things Mara could name from memory. A borrowed heartbeat, a pocket full of excuses, an unlikely coincidence, and, most importantly, a promise to be believed. On the table, the lamp flickered. Somewhere in the lattice of shelves, a whisper grew like a rumor into a sound. Why does it smell like this? Why does your species' nostalgia function as an attractor field? Mara's hand paused in the book. She had a tendency, when faced with things that expected lying, to choose truth instead, not because truth was simpler, but because truth was undeniable. However, the compendium had rules, the first of which is, some things in the universe expect stories, give them one they prefer. The second is, honesty can be a weapon, if shaped like a story. She thought of the coffee mug, chipped at the rim from civilization and years of stubborn use. She thought of the way her grandmother used to tell bedtime stories in a voice that could sow afraid thought into something new. She considered briskly that if the library had a thing that liked stories enough to eat them, she might as well offer something that kept the thing from being hungry. Mara read aloud. This is a book for the misplaced, the lost, the things that don't fit the labels the universe handed them. It is for pens that ran out of ink in the middle of their confessions. It is for shadows that forgot their shapes. It is for doors that opened to neighborhoods instead of notions. I was sent here, by nobody and everyone, to tell you that you are welcome to be wrong. That's not a permission slip, it's an argument. The lamp steadied. The wardstones around the portal hummed in a more polite register. Somewhere in the walls, the library sighed. It was a small miracle, or an administrative miracle. The compendium settled, as if deciding that Mara's story was acceptable, then smiled in a way Mara felt in her molars. Books, even dangerous ones, appreciated sincerity that was inventive. They preferred when a liar told a true story wrapped inside it. The sound of the klaxon stopped. For a moment nothing else happened, then the sentinel's antennae drooped. We have catalogued breaches where beasts escape. We have quarantined storms. We have reconstituted entire mythologies. We have never encountered a book that made the whole wing smell like a backyard in early summer. You probably will now, Mara said. It's seasonal, also high-quality paper. They closed the compendium and carried it with ceremony that felt like an apology to the registry. The Ombra sentinel called for signatures and forms, which is the library's preferred method of converting magic into something absorptive. Every signature binds an edge, every name steeps a fragment of reality into a glossary. Forms were filled, stamped, translated into 3 languages that no living soul spoke comfortably, and then set into a slot that led to the main vault. Mara signed her name twice, once with her full legal appellation and once with a nickname she used only for her small rebellions. The sentinel looked at both and considered. You have done what the keeper would do, which is useful. You also did what no keeper would do. And that is? Mara asked. You smiled, unnecessarily. Mara let her face do what it did best. Well, she said, someone has to keep the place human. The days that followed were small and grand in equal measure. A committee convened, 3 witnesses, 1 notary, a sentient lamp, and they deliberated the classification of the compendium. It was, eventually, labeled an artifact of gentle misunderstanding, which is as close as the Atlantean registry would ever come to calling something a book that fixes things by telling them they are loved. The label was stamped in triplicate and placed beneath a glass plate that reflected the visitor's face back at them in unflattering light. The The library continued to be the library, shelves bent toward the light like tired confessors, stairways that led you to the metaphor you were hiding from, and atrium that smelled faintly like someone's childhood. But the compendium kept a corner of the adulted world warm, a place where things that had been misfiled could check in and be given new tags without judgment. Penship improved in suspicious ways, lost keys reappeared in margins, entire minor myths apologized and found themselves useful. The Codex Confluence rebalanced, grudgingly grateful. And yet, as the routine settled like dust on old folios, Mara received notes, tiny missives tucked into the pages of books she carried home, a thank-you scribble from a minor legend, the address of a lost neighbor tucked into the map section of a travelogue, the recipe for a pie that someone in a different timeline had never learned but really wanted. The notes smelled of